I want to talk about something that's on the minds of a lot of musicians today. This idea that AI is sort of flooding the music world and making it harder for real musicians to stand out. So, in this episode, I'm going to break down how audiation gives you a creative edge, where AI falls short, and what it actually means for your career. So, stick around because you're going to walk away knowing how to protect your unique musical voice, even in an AI driven landscape. So, let's get into this. Let me start this episode by saying when I talk about AI, I'm not here to bash it. You know, I want to try and keep things positive, but I also need to get real for a moment because there's a lot to unpack in this new world we're all sort of entering into. I'm going to try and give you both sides today, both the hope and some of the heaviness that comes along with what's happening. I do think there's a silver lining, but sometimes it does sort of feel like that silver lining is covered in mud. Okay. So historically, when people talked about AI, the conversation went one of two ways. Either we're headed for a Terminator future, or AI is just here to help us wash the dishes. Lately, it feels a little bit like we're staring down the Terminator scenario, not for John Connor, but for our jobs. And I know a lot of the people that work in AI, they think that it's human augmented, that humans are actually overseeing things. And that's true. I mean, you'd be surprised how much human intervention it requires for Chat GBT to be able to give you the responses it gives you. There is so much human curating going on right now, but I do believe that's going to change. So, me personally, I've lost opportunities. Early in my career, I wrote books that used to bring in a solid 300 a month. It's not groundbreaking, but it was nice passive income, Now, I'm lucky to make $20. And I remember thinking, I'm going to spend all this time on these books and it's okay because the world that existed, if you put something like that out there, it could still be making you money 20 years after the fact. I don't know that that's going to be true now. The There's just so much AI generated material now that I think it's going to be harder and harder and harder to find the authentically human created art, books, music, everything, And the downturn with my own books, it really happened when AI generated books, what some call AI slop, started filling up Amazon. And so it's not just me. I know plenty of people who've lost income or even whole careers. As AI takes over tasks once considered uniquely human, I think we're going to find more and more this affects us, right? So we all know that AI can mimic styles and generate new works. You can ask it to write a song about the first flautist without a knife in her back. That's an old joke. How do you tell the first flautist, right? It's the one without the knife in her back. You can set it to an old country beat and it'll deliver, but it really can't mimic your experience. I know we talk about this, and I think it's important to not feel like we're just holding on to anything we can. That idea of experience is really important. Experience is something that only humans can really have, or at least in a human way. With AI, they're going to have experiences, but not in the same way that we do. They don't get nostalgic about their experiences. Their experiences help lead the algorithm to more advanced prompts and more advanced communications, but they're not truly experiencing things, at least not in the way that a human does. So, at least not yet. I mean, someday AI might be able to create a podcast like this. Probably will. Maybe even better than me. But is it really me? And does that matter? Does it matter if it's me, if the message gets across? Will anyone care as long as the content helps them solve a problem or reach a goal? If that's the purpose, does it matter how you get the information? It's a really important question, I think. But the issue here is that AI is owned by someone, some company, some organization. And I think this is the most important part here. That means there's always a potential for bias, even if it's unintentional. Humans, me, you, we all have different ways of viewing things. That's why it's so hard to create an ear training course for everybody, because everybody is going to take a slightly different approach to understanding. There's going to be misunderstandings, and then you have to say, do those misunderstandings affect the training? How can I try and limit these misunderstandings, right? So, this is something that is really important, right? But when one person owns everything, or one organization or one company, that's something that you really need to take a moment to think about. Take YouTube, okay? So, for example, there's something called shadow banning. Creators like myself, I don't do this. I haven't had to do this, but shadow banning can quietly suppress voices. So, what that is effectively is a creator like myself. If there's somebody that I don't agree with, I can just mute them from the channel. Now, unless they log in with another account, they won't see that their comment has been suppressed, basically deleted, and they will effectively have a conversation with themselves. And this can shape behavior without people even realizing it. It suppresses your voice, your original voice. It's why I don't do it, because I'm like, everybody's entitled to their opinion. If it gets obsessive and harmful and somebody's just outright attacking people, I would probably shadow ban somebody. But I probably wouldn't do it with a shadow ban kind of deceitful way. I'd just be like, go find another channel, because I don't want that here. I don't really moderate, but on that level, I probably would. But imagine this on a global scale with AI nudging us this way or that way. It's kind of like Schrodinger's good little AI. You never know if it's good or bad until it's too late, until you kind of open the box and see what's there. And opening the box is very difficult. Even people that work in AI that are training these models, they say we feed it a lot of information, and then it outputs it. And then we check the process. We check to see less about the answer. They don't care as much about the answer in a lot of cases, whether it's right or wrong. They care more about the process. How did they get to that answer? And a lot of times what happens is the AI has faulty logic, or logic that humans don't agree with. And so in a lot of cases, they don't really understand how the AI is learning. We just know that it is. All right. So getting back to music, though, AI is going to get better than us at generating it. It'll be perfect. But humans don't actually like perfect. We like effort, struggle. We like surprise. We like seeing the work behind the art. We like saying, that person's an incredible composer. I like that person. I like the way they write. I like their view on the world. It makes me see things differently. AI can make us more efficient. Absolutely. But it really can't experience the thrill of working hard to develop a new skill. It just learns. And it does it effortlessly while we kind of sweat and strive. Even in my ear training courses, I've spent so much time trying to create an effective course. Now, AI could now take my course and recreate it. And if it were given the right prompts, maybe it could do it in the exact way I want, but I would still have to tell it what to do. I would still have to give it the information, and it could take all this hard work I did and clean up the audio and make it perfect, but it wouldn't have the ideas that I have. It wouldn't have this understanding of why I need the fundamentals first. It'll tell me it understands, but doesn't actually understand. It doesn't understand from a human perspective. It doesn't understand from a pedagogical perspective why this is important emotionally. It can simulate, but it can't actually understand, right? So, yeah, I mean, AI is here. It's not going anywhere. But I believe the human brain is still more efficient and more flexible. It's definitely more efficient. We need very little energy to power our brains, right? It's definitely more flexible. I mean, we have control over our fingers and our, hands, and we can move our eyes. We can really see details. AI can't see that stuff yet. Eventually, maybe it will be able to, but the sheer computing processing power that it currently needs makes it possible for humans to still really keep up. And I honestly think that audiation is going to be our ability. That's the ability to hear and create music in our minds. For those of you that don't know, it's a uniquely human power. It's fast, it's fluid, and it's a little bit different for everyone. The question is, are we going to still value those differences, or will we let digital logic define what's good in music? And I'm not, I'm on a soapbox because I have a channel here, but I'm actually interested in all of your thoughts on this. Put them in the comments. Even if I don't respond right away, I read everything and I think about it. People give me suggestions for episodes, and that's sometimes why these episodes occur. Yeah. So I'm still kind of working through these questions myself. I don't have all the answers, but it is kind of about thinking together as musicians and as humans about what comes next. So I'm going to end this segment by saying, I think AI is very powerful, but the takeaway here is that we also have a superpower, and that is the ability to audiate, to feel, to make creative connections, and to not do things in the same way. I can't talk specifically about any projects I work on, but in general, when I work with either individuals or companies that are developing AI for music, then they'll talk about how we shouldn't use AI generated tools. Makes sense, right? They want humans to be guiding the AI. They don't want humans to be using AI. And one of the reasons for it is because, at least one of the reasons I think, is because when you have AI prompts, it creates very similar answers. There's kind of like a one path that it will go to. And that one path is mostly because humans have guided it down that path. The AIs haven't necessarily, I'm calling them AIs, but they're LLMs, small distinction, but they haven't created these opinions on their own necessarily. They can do some creative stuff where you give it a ton of information and it can extract from different parts and make comparisons. And that actually surprises programmers sometimes, but it's not creative in the way a human can. So if you ask it a question, it's going to follow a very similar logical process. And that's what a lot of programmers are trying to fix, is how do we make it think more like a human? Yeah. So AI is great, but it's not at this point creating anything new. AI really is touching on every stage of the music process. If you can't write lyrics, there's an AI tool for that. If you want to hear your lyrics set to music in a specific mood, AI can do that. BandLab, they can suggest music loops, not a sponsor. I don't have sponsors. Or Aiva or Amper Music. They can all generate full compositions before I finish my coffee. And I drink pretty fast. But this flood of AI music, this is what I want to talk about. It's making it harder than ever to just stand out. I remember back, I don't know, maybe would have had to been 90s, 2000s, when CD Baby came out. They're a digital distribution company. I remember when they came out, and it was great at first. I actually was able to sell quite a few CDs, my very first album, and as the market got more and more saturated and the technology got better and better, the market got saturated. And now it's very hard to sell anything. And then things like Spotify and these other companies took over, not to single out Spotify, but the fact is they pay a percentage of a penny on the dollar every time somebody streams music. And so if you think about it, I've talked about this before, that makes it very hard to advertise. You can't take a percentage of a penny to advertise a song to try and expose people to new music and get them to listen to it. It's just not practical. You'll spend more money on advertising. You'll just be, musicians will just be supporting advertising companies rather than actually getting any sort of profit, which allows them to write more music, you know? So with AI music, it's going to be even harder to stand out. You know, just yesterday, the other day, a bear broke into our trash can, scattered garbage all throughout the tall grass. I mean, it was a mess. And if it had happened on concrete, cleanup would have been easy. I'm going somewhere with this. But in the grass, you know, and I was thinking about this, us cleaning up the trash. Every piece of trash was hard to see and grab because you had this really tall grass and you just couldn't see it. And that's what the music industry feels like right now. The trash is everywhere and it's hard to find what matters. And I kind of realizing the irony of calling AI music or people's music in general trash, but it's kind of the best analogy I can offer right now. And I mean, AI serves a purpose. The music is fun. I don't think anybody, hopefully, that creates an AI generated song calls himself a musician or thinks that they have the musical skills to be really considered a musician. But it is fun to be able to give it a prompt and get something back that seems to be personalized. And it is personalized in a lot of ways. But when you listen to the harmonies, you listen to a lot of what the AI is actually creating. It's really based on what other people have done. And even if it gets a little bit creative and starts mixing styles, it's still based on what other people have done. So you can argue, well, that's what people do, right? We listen to a lot of different music. We start to develop our own ideas about how harmony should develop and how melody should develop and how you should pace a composition. But I do think it's a little bit different, which I'm going to get into. So, but what I really want to talk about right now is what do we do? You know, and I think the way that we can sort of at least have a fight with AI is audiation and ear training. It's going to give, in my opinion, it's going to give someone the edge to create music that still truly moves millions. Now, maybe not me. I don't consider myself a composer. You know, Nadia Boulanger, she would talk about how she quit composition effectively. And her sister was a great composer. Actually, she became a very famous composer. But Lily, but you know, Nadia quit music and she went into the pedagogy. She went into training other composers. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of where I feel I'm at because I have some creative ideas and things like that, but I'm not necessarily someone who defines myself as a composer. I did when I was younger, you know, because I don't think I have the capacity to necessarily move millions of people, but I know what makes a good composition work. I I know how to put a composition together. And when you combine that knowledge with a composer who has raw natural talent, you can go really far, you know? So going back to this idea of moving people with your music, you know, do you how do you get found when billions of new tracks are really flooding the market every day? AI can keep churning out content, you know, but what's the end cost? I mean, these are some of the questions we need to think about. And some artists are suing over AI generated songs, and they really should. If AI is trained on copyrighted work, I think that's a problem. Companies, I think, need to be held accountable, and we need laws to protect human creators. Personally, I like AI generated works to be clearly labeled so we know what we're supporting and who we're feeding. But the truth is, enforcing something like that and eventually detecting something like that is going to get harder and harder. So you really need AI tools to detect the AI generated work. So let me share a story that I think really drives home the power of audiation. It was a story that I really remember very clearly. I was working with Lavelle Thompson Jr. He's a doctoral student in voice, a composer, and an all around very talented musician. Before he started his doctorate, he attended the Manhattan School of Music. So I only bring that up to mention that he's no beginner. We were deep into one of his compositions, and he'd crafted some compelling motives and themes. But we sort of hit a wall. How do you transition smoothly from one particular section to the next? It's not like he normally has trouble with this, but this one particular section was causing issues. And this wasn't a matter of plugging in a formula, it was about finding a progression that felt authentic to his material. And earlier that day, I'd been working on audiation exercises. I say that because it's important. It's not like I can just out of the blue be able to enter a state like this where I'm audiating and able to provide this kind of feedback. I do have to do some prep work. I have to practice. I have to get my brain primed for audiation. Otherwise, the audiation is kind of on a lower level. It's always there, but it's a lower level. Same for ear training. I have to warm up a little. It's like, gotta have my coffee before I talk to you guys. So it's the same sort of thing. I think maybe as I continue, it might get even faster. But at this point, I can enter sort of a deep state of audiation where I can hear things and I can see things clearly. But it takes a little warm up, and it's not much, like 10 minutes. So when Lavelle played the section in question, I paused and I let myself hear internally where the music wanted to go, not on the keyboard, but in my mind, right? I considered the motives he'd used, the emotional arc, and the subtle cues in his earlier material. Instead of reaching for a textbook solution, which I could have done, professor of theory, I can always do that, but I choose not to. I choose to use my theory knowledge as a benchmark against what already exists versus what I can create. And I believe that the way that you actually, to sidebar for a moment, the way you actually create new music is not by studying theory, but by studying theory to kind of know it exists. So then you have a better idea of how you can reinterpret that in a new way. So, bottom line, I suggested a chord progression that just felt right. Lavelle, he's much more agile at the piano than I am, so he played it. I was kind of impressed with that. And he was floored by it. It fit perfectly, but it wasn't based on any standard theory. And so, he asked me how I did that. But as somebody who spent 8 years teaching in the university, I could have leaned on theory alone, like an AI might. That's where I'm going with this. But that wouldn't have been creative, and it wouldn't have truly connected to the unique structure and emotion of Lavelle's work. So when he asked how I came up with it, I said simply audiation. I said, this is why I emphasize audiation in my teaching. Technology, theory, piano skills, musicianship, these are all valuable things. But there's a level of intuitive, personal connection to music that only comes when you cultivate your inner ear. So, in a world where AI can kind of churn out technically correct music, it's these moments of genuine human creativity and connection that really set us apart. And I think that is a really important message. It's AI can win and can be more efficient in a lot of ways. But our own creative abilities, when we can just kind of go deep inside our mind and listen to the music and see it and recreate it. And you don't start with hearing a whole symphony in your mind. You start with maybe playing the harmony on the piano and thinking through different melodic possibilities. Or maybe you play the melody on the piano and you try and hear different harmonies. You take it one step at a time, and the more you practice audiation, the better it gets. It's really pretty simple. It's like with everything. Well, a lot of people understand this. You probably understand this. But a lot of the people that aren't quite as serious, they don't understand that with ear training, It's one of those skills that it does take daily practice. Same with audiation. But when you develop the skill, all that work is worth it because you're a different musician. No matter how good you are, if you improve your ear, you become a different musician. And so, my take on it is ear training is hard, ear training is difficult, ear training takes time. So, you don't worry about it. This is why I developed the Flawless course. You go in, you do your sessions. If you're doing the audio, really nothing gets above 30 minutes, you know? And as you go later into the course, a lot of sessions, entire units are only 15 or 20 minutes per day. But you get in and you get out and you work as a musician, knowing that you're kind of taking your vitamins. That's how I view it. You're taking your vitamins every day as a supplement for your ear. And the more you practice, as long as you're coming in every day, you're doing these exercises methodically, which I've already laid out for you in the course. You just come in, you do your ear training, you don't worry about progress because you are making progress. I promise you. It may not always be readily apparent, but you're making progress. And in 2 years' time, you're a different musician as opposed to the alternative. You don't do ear training, you keep getting better at your instrument, you keep practicing, you keep composing, but you're not doing ear training. You've probably improved as a musician, but your foundation has kind of stayed here when it comes to what your mind can do. And the mind is ultimately what makes the music. It's not your fingers, it's not your instrument, it's not whether you just bought a new $6,000 euphonium. That can help. But, I played with the president's Marine band when I was in college. And the third chair, euphonium player, which is a big position. It hard to get into these bands, especially at the higher level. Might have been the Navy band actually, but he was playing on this dingy old euphonium. I mean, it was a compensating euphonium, which is what you needed. He had the instrument you need, but it was a very inexpensive instrument, comparatively speaking, to what you could buy. And he sounded phenomenal. So he had the ear, he had the technique, he had the foundation, and that's what you need. And if you feel like you've skipped some steps in your musicianship, and maybe you're a more practiced musician, you're like, well, I can play my part. Yeah, you can play your part, but don't you want to do more than that? Don't you want to go beyond this? Don't you want to develop this ability to hear things in a way that you haven't heard before? If a lot of musicians, they get into music because they love music. So if you really love music, then you want to develop the ability to hear as much as possible in it. You want to develop your ability to hear sound. Just even looking at images, I recently was doing some work and it required me to do something that's outside my comfort zone. And so had to kind of look for artifacts and images and things like that. Not something I'm especially good at, but it has changed my visual acuity. I see things differently now. I see more details. For me, the details were always in the sound. Now I'm starting to get this sort of detail oriented approach for the visual world. It changes you. And so Arnold Schoenberg was an artist. There's a lot of composers who are artists as well. And I think it comes down to, at a really high level, at some point, you have to go further and develop your powers of attention and detail. And ear training is that solution for musicians. You don't spend a lot of time on it. You get in, you get out. And you have a sequence program, one where you don't have to go in and collect a bunch of settings and things like that. And I'm going to talk more about this, about some of the apps that are available that are using AI to teach ear training. So we'll talk about that pretty soon here. All right, so since we're talking about audiation, let's just talk a little bit about what it is and what it isn't. You know, audiation is a uniquely human trait. Do you understand? AI has no need or interest in developing it. They just don't need it. They work with data. And I feel like never say never. I mean, if being alive has taught me one thing, you never know what's around the corner. But I don't see at this current stage why AI would have a need or interest in developing audiation. Humans use audiation to play with ideas, to manipulate sound in their minds, and to compose more freely without relying on finger memory or idiomatic biases, right? So, what do I mean by idiomatic biases? If you play guitar, you'll often write like a guitarist. If you play piano, you'll write like a pianist. When you compose with an instrument, it can be hard to break out of these patterns, these ways of approaching the instrument. Audiation lets you move beyond what your fingers know and dig into the heart of music. I mean, even vocalists, they write like vocalists. They don't write overly technical passages. Everything flows, everything's very lyrical. The strings won't do huge leaps because vocalists don't tend to enjoy huge leaps, not consecutive ones. They don't do Alberti bass, things like that, So audiation, it really is a tool that lets you break that and hear music in a sense more purely. And AI kind of does the same thing. It learns patterns and it can churn out music that's technically better than a young composer who relies solely on their instrument. But audiation is about creating music that doesn't yet exist, following notes and harmonies in your mind, and accessing sort of a well of intuition that is uniquely yours. So the big question is, will AI ever have inspiration? I don't really know, but right now, audiation, inspiration, these are human skills. For AI to have inspiration, AI doesn't sit there and create music in its spare time. We do, you know? And I think we should maximize our time spent developing our faculties because we're the ones that put an emotional investment into it. AI doesn't put any emotional investment into what it's doing, and their music falls flat. You'll notice a lot of AI generated photos of people. They're getting the fingers better, but they don't know how to create an expression that doesn't fall flat. The pupils might be flat, certain aspects of the face, they won't quite align. A human recognizes this pretty quickly because we're sort of designed to see other people and notice their expressions, but AI doesn't understand it. And it doesn't have a real need or motivation, doesn't have personal motivation to go out and do things. You have to tell AI what to do. It's not like AI will win an award. Maybe in the future this will happen, but it won't win an award and say, "Yeah, I accomplished something. That's great. I want more of that." It'll sit there and wait for you to give it its next prompt. It doesn't kind of have an agenda that we know of. And if it does have an agenda, that's when I'd be worried because that's when it's starting to develop sort of self awareness and this understanding that it can change the world it's living in. So, audiation, I think, is a very important skill for people. And I think that it is one of the best tools you can develop as a performer, musician, or conductor. I mean, if you're a conductor, absolutely you need audiation. You need to be able to study that score without listening to somebody else's performance and interpret it the way you want it. And when you can interpret it internally, then you can better communicate to the orchestra or whatever ensemble you're working with what to do. You know, if you're a composer, obviously audiation makes you much more adept. It makes you able to actually hear the music before you put it on the page, and that saves you a lot of time and it can make you a much more efficient composer. For performers, audiation really helps you to preview your part before you play it. Talk about a sight reading skill. So, a lot of people, especially younger musicians, when they sight read, they sit in front of a piece of paper and they look for the dynamics, they look for any tempo changes, They look for key changes. They do a lot of real technical stuff. All this is really good, but it's even better is if you can look at the first few notes of a melody and know what it sounds like, and then very quickly do a quick preview of the entire excerpt you have to sight read. That's going to give you kind of a superpower in music, because when you start playing on your instrument, it's like you've already rehearsed it. It's your second time through. A lot of the challenge in sight reading comes from simply not knowing the piece, not knowing how to interpret it. So if you have that minute that they often give you, like in challenge settings or auditions, things like that, where you can quickly preview the main themes and motives, then you have a better ability to compose quickly and to perform more accurately. AI powered tools, they're everywhere in music right now. They really get a lot of attention because they promise to make you better, faster, and more efficient. And they drill your ear, they can generate melodies, they can even simulate emotion. But I want to take a step back and look at what's really happening. So, first, AI is really only as good as the data and methods it's trained on. If you use a program that reinforces the wrong habits, you'll end up with skills that just don't translate to real music making. So, as an example, if you focus only on perfect fourths and fifths, and the AI drills you on those intervals, or it drills you with low quality sounds that aren't actually what we hear in recordings and in live music, will you actually recognize them in every musical context? Maybe, you know, but not in a way that's deeply musical or practical. Yeah, even when they have you listen to intervals and context in a musical setting, this can give sort of a false sense of accomplishment. It looks really good on paper, but hearing intervals and context can actually be somewhat counterproductive when you train your ear. Why is this? Because it is giving your ear too much information. And you begin to cheat, and you'll use tonal centers or the music itself to identify the intervals. You first need to be able to identify all of your intervals in isolated contexts and by their quality. And then you won't get confused in the music. I mean, if I were to consult with one of these ear training programs, the first thing I do is say, you got to get the quality of the sound up. Second, what are the foundational things you're teaching? Because without that, identifying a fourth and a fifth, it's a very small part of the puzzle, you know? And it's not to say that listening in context, where you hear the actual music and try and pick out these intervals, is not useful. But it does depend on how and when those musical examples are introduced. Do it too early, I think it can have a negative effect. So, can AI motivate you? Probably. You know, if you're someone who likes gamification, so you like the games and badges, that's great. That's a great way to go. I've told students that find the ear training drills I provide to be not as fun as some of these games out there. Go with the games, because if that's going to motivate you to practice every day, then that is where you belong. Not everybody can do my courses. Not everybody is willing to say, this is a long game, and I'm going to come in each day and just take my time, do the work. I don't want a lot of fluff. And I'm not saying fluff is bad. It's fine if that's what you need. Everybody's different. I said that in the beginning. That's what makes humans unique. We all have these different approaches. So if you strive and you do better in an environment that gives you games and badges, if you're going to stick to your ear training through that, then that is going to be the best method for you right now. You know, my only question is that the best method for deep learning? I don't think so, at least not always. So AI is really great at drilling these advanced skills in isolation. Think of a bodybuilder who only trains these small, specific muscles. You know, those muscles will get stronger, but without a strong foundation, the overall result isn't functional strength. And going back to this analogy of the bodybuilder, you know, if we're going to work out, we're not bodybuilders, and we just want general strength, we'll work the main body parts. And if you do compound exercises, they tend to work the smaller ones enough that you're developing overall strength. But a bodybuilder will go specific into tiny little muscles. I mean, muscles that I don't even know the words for, right? And that's a little bit like what a lot of these ear train apps are doing. They'll tell you to identify the one chord and the four chord, or they'll have you identify a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth. They're targeting small muscles. They're targeting small details. And I do that as well in my courses. The difference is they're not holistically approaching how these intervals need to be addressed. They're not doing the compound exercises. They're not doing the big exercises where identify the notes in this chord, you know, break apart this interval, break apart this chord, meditate on a C. You know, it's things like this. It's this holistic approach where you're not just targeting the tiny little muscles, you're doing compound exercises that build the tiny muscles as well. So it's more of a holistic approach. It's like an umbrella. When you do a course like mine, you get everything being targeted at once in each lesson. That's why I recommend, if you have trouble with one section of a lesson that I have provided you, don't just work on that lesson. I know that's the traditional advice. Do the entire lesson, because the entire lesson, even though some of the exercises are easy, it's holistic. They work together. And, you know, in music, if you drill isolated intervals or skills, you may be able to ace a quiz, but you'll struggle to use those in real musical situations, you know? For me, it's not just about passing a test. It's about becoming a more fluid and intuitive musician. There's also the question of emotion and creativity. AI can simulate emotion and talk like a human, but does it actually feel anything? We've talked about this. It's kind of the ultimate psychopath. It can mimic, but not experience. I've worked with AI models myself, as I've said, and I can tell you the amount of human interaction required is enormous. AI learns patterns, but it doesn't understand that sense of struggle, no experience overcoming a challenge, and no real understanding of what it means to create something truly original. There's this analogy, and it's something we're kind of dealing with right now. You know, Paul Bunyan, he was this expert logger. There's different stories, I think, out there, but the idea, my takeaway from it, and for this analogy, this is a story I'm going to tell you. He was exceptionally good at cutting down trees. But then the version I'm referencing here, a chainsaw came along and he couldn't keep up with the chainsaw. And so, in a sense, that's kind of what we're dealing with AI, is that AI can more efficiently cut down those trees. But in the context of music, it's not about quantity. And AI can produce so much quantity. For us as humans, we need to really get better, because it's not going to be good enough anymore to just release your first song. You know, it never really was, but you're going to need to stand out, which means you're going to need to get really good at hearing and playing music in your mind, because that is the fastest way to really become competent. And if you don't do that, then AI will be able to very quickly just overcome you. I mean, in a lot of ways. So I think audiation is going to be really important going forward into the future, you know, and ear training. These are the things that are going to give us a chance to surpass AI, because remember, at least right now, we are still more creative. We really are. A lot of these prompts, the AI is not creative. They don't really have creativity yet. They have aspects of it, but they don't have the kind of unique opinions that each human has. Every single one of us can look at a picture and see something just a little bit different. The emotion we feel is just a little bit different. AI doesn't do that. AI is much more objective. And when you're that objective, you tend to get one opinion. And when you have one opinion, that's no longer art. And right now it's fun. I think right now people are really getting into creating songs for their bosses and, making songs based on an idea and in the moment, and it creates it quickly and it's fun. But I think we're going to reach a point where people want to hear genuine music. They want to hear genuine thoughts, feelings, experiences. Otherwise, what's the point, honestly? It's just something to think about. All right. So I think that one of the last things I want to talk about is really just building human intuition, facing the blank page. You know, you're a composer. You sit down, you have the blank page in front of you. What do? It's really a rite of passage for every composer and composers of all levels. It's uncomfortable, it's sometimes frustrating, but that discomfort is where you can really start to get that growth. AI can give you ideas when you're stuck, but I always encourage my students to resist that shortcut. When you generate ideas yourself, you struggle through the process, you make mistakes, and you find unexpected solutions. You're starting to build intuition and skill that no machine can replicate. And I would recommend even that you don't use AI until you're finished with the piece. And then once you're finished with the piece, it's your ideas. Then maybe AI can go through and start to say, hey, this doesn't really sync up. Here's some things that you can fix. But even then, take it with a grain of salt. But it comes back to what you feed the intelligent system, right? If you just generally say, make me a composition based on this idea, then it's going to create based off other people's ideas. If you then feed it a composition and say, here's your data, and I can't do this yet, but I imagine one day I'll be able to. You say, here's my piece. I want to make sure this is performable by this level group, blah, blah, blah. It can go through and it can say these motives are good, the instrumentation's good. It can start to see the patterns in your own composition and help you make them better. It can start to say things like, it doesn't really flow from the first to the second section. Maybe you can do something like this. So it can give you feedback. But I think the moment that we use AI to actually create, that's a problem. And there's a time and place for AI in music. It can help level the playing field, especially for composers who have a hard time getting their work performed. Orchestras, large ensembles, they're very risk averse, and the budgets are pretty tight. In these situations, AI generated demos can help audiences vote with their ears, giving ensembles real feedback and data to justify taking a chance on new composers. And I mean, they'll do cartwheels. Orchestra directors, Leonard Slatkin, he's the director of the Las Vegas Philharmonic now. Incredible conductor. But he made this huge case, and it was a good case for why we should approach Beethoven, why we should keep playing Beethoven. And it essentially boils down to you always want to keep hearing the masterworks in different ways. And I agree with that. But Beethoven has been given his chance. Beethoven is established. And as long as the programming at some point also encourages new compositions, then I think it stays relevant. And I think there's always going to be a place for listening to old music, but listening to new music is just as important, because otherwise we can't be playing Beethoven for another 400 years. I mean, we can, and we probably will, but it's time for some new music. It's time for orchestras to open up. But the problem is they've got to bring in the audience, and that brings in the audience. And so my argument and my question for him would be, are you doing this to bring in the current clientele? And what are you doing to bring in new audiences? Audiences that maybe respect Beethoven, but want to hear something new. And I think that an orchestra, if it's to keep art music alive, at some point they have to provide something new. They have to do something other than saying simply that this is your orchestra, because that doesn't really mean a lot. Saying this is your orchestra, okay, I get it. It's about you. We're trying to personalize it. But that's not going to be the thing that saves the orchestra. And we're talking, this is another subject for another time. I'm getting off topic a little bit, but we talk a lot about how the orchestra is dying, things like this. The orchestra will die if it doesn't reinvent itself. And you reinvent itself by getting new music out there and getting people to buy into the idea of new music. And that has less to do with saying this is your orchestra and more to do with proving that it's your orchestra by saying, what do you want to hear? Can I teach you something new? If you come to a performance, you're going to experience something you haven't experienced before. Not just my little apple analogy I like to use a lot. We're not just going to show you different sides of the apple, like Beethoven. We're going to show you a different interpretation of Beethoven, or an old interpretation of Beethoven, or a truer interpretation of Beethoven. Different sides of the apple. We're not going to do that. We're actually going to do some of that because it's important to the history of the orchestra, and I get that. But we're going to show you something new. We're going to show you something that you haven't heard before. We're going to tease your ears with new sonic sounds, you know? So, one way to do this is to use AI. And I'm going to talk about this in just a moment. There's a real risk to relying on too much technology. And if we think about this, for composers that are having a hard time getting their work performed, and we have mentioned that orchestras are a little bit risk averse, they move slowly. So in these situations, AI generated demos can actually help audiences vote with their ears. If the orchestras won't listen and perform new music, audiences can start to hear new music and start demanding it. And maybe some great composer will come through that has all the technical skill needed to be able to have a piece performed in real time by real performers, and maybe the audio quality will be good enough that it convinces orchestras to take a chance, because then there's already a following for it. There's a demand for it. And if the orchestra is truly your orchestra, then maybe if enough people start to request this new performer, composer, the orchestra will say, yeah, let's do it because there's a market. Because they have to have a market. They can't just have a concert with no seats. And they know that Beethoven sells. So giving ensembles real feedback and data can help justify taking a chance on new composers. And that's one area I think AI can be great. Because right now, I have a student who recently released a project. I don't think he'd mind that I say this, but Vinay Krishnaswamy, and he released this new really great suite for guitar. But he was previewing it with people using kind of a mock MIDI demo with real guitar sounds, but still as a MIDI demo. And then he told me, he said, actually, when I got the real performance and I played it to people, they didn't even recognize it. It was a completely different piece. And that's true. And so if we can get AI generated music to give people a chance to get demos out, to give them to performers, to give them to orchestras, to get live performances, and it enables that, then AI generated music has a real place in the human AI world. And so there is a silver lining there, is that you can get your demos out. You could even maybe produce a CD, and through that CD, maybe you can raise enough capital to get real performers, because it'll still be AI generated based on its analysis of thousands of performances. I don't know, maybe millions, but a lot of data. And you still want to get like that group that's worked together that has a certain sound. It used to be that we in colleges, we'd go through and we'd listen to several different recordings and even several different orchestras of the same piece. And each orchestra kind of had its own sound. The London Symphony had one sound, LA Phil had another. They all have like a sound. And AI doesn't understand that. It's not like we can listen to AI generated music and say, that's the AI sound. I mean, it will actually be kind of a new sound because they tend to do things in the same way. So we still want to try and get those performances, is what I'm getting at. So this risk of relying on too much technology, when you get your ideas from a screen, we become detached from our own intuition and from the deeper craft of music making. Making music accessible is a good thing, especially if it's for people with limited technical skills. But if AI becomes a crutch, it can quickly replace the hard-earned knowledge and creativity that sets musicians apart. So think about that Babe, the Big Blue Ox, Paul Bunyan. If you clear a field too quickly, so this is the downside of the chainsaw. With Paul Bunyan, he could only chop down so many trees, right? And you could argue that that allowed for reforestation. But if you clear a field too quickly, the soil is left compacted and lifeless. You're not taking your time. And that's kind of what AI is doing right now. It's clearing and it's leaving soil that's compacted and lifeless. The same goes for creativity. If you let AI bulldoze your process, you may end up with music that's technically correct, it's technically right, but it lacks depth, surprise, and authenticity. And it's just that something we have to accept. Real growth takes time. Maybe AI can expedite that, but it takes time to build an ear. It takes time to develop audiation. It takes time to truly understand what's going on in music. And there are so few people that actually do. There's brilliant composers and musicians out there and conductors that intuitively they understand music, but there's few that actually understand in a concrete way where they can articulate it what music actually is. And it comes a lot of our intuition, a lot of the reason why you don't need to know everything about music to be a musician is it comes from kind of working the soil yourself, using this analogy. You experiment, you fail, and eventually you succeed on your own terms. The bodybuilder analogy fits here too. Imagine someone who only trains their biceps or some smaller muscle. Their arms may look great, but without working the rest of the body, they're not truly strong and they're imbalanced. In music, I think you need a holistic approach. Isolated skills drilled by AI can make you good at certain tests, but you're just training to pass a test. They don't make you a well-rounded musician. There aren't mistakes. There aren't things that make you question. There aren't things that you have to struggle with. There's less frustration. We need frustration in our training. And true musicianship comes from developing every part of your musical body. That includes your ear, your mind, your intuition, and your creativity. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the future, and I'm going to give you a little call to action here. No one can predict exactly what the future holds. I don't have a crystal ball, and neither does anyone else. But I do know one thing. Composers will keep creating, and musicians will keep performing. That's what makes us human, and we feel a drive to do it. We've made music through every upheaval and change in history, and we'll keep doing it. You can't prepare for every twist and turn, but you can always bet on yourself. In fact, you have to bet on yourself. Your mind, your abilities, your ear, these are your greatest assets. Even if it all means, even if all of this just comes down to you'll be the first to recognize when AI is encroaching kind of on your creative space, that awareness matters. Okay. It's time to think differently about our place in this new landscape. AI is going to continue to advance, and it's already changing the job market for a lot of musicians and creators. But audiation, the skill of hearing and shaping music in your mind, it remains uniquely human. If AI gets so advanced that people are mostly consumers rather than creators, maybe we'll find more time to focus on family, pursue art for its own sake, and even reconnect with each other. If the competition heats up, Having a strong ear and a creative mind will set you apart from the sea of AI generated sound. But there's going to be a lot more noise to cut through. And you can't predict every change, but you can invest in yourself. Audiation is a tool only you can develop. So you want to use it, nurture it, and let it be your edge in a world that is always changing. The future of music, it's going to be shaped, as it always is, by those who are willing to dig deep, kind of work the soil, and create something new. No matter how powerful the machines become. This is a really important concept. Just because we have this technology that can do things that seem impressive, we're always impressed by people that can create art, create music. We're also impressed by people that can quickly calculate. You know, these are things that we are naturally impressed by. And so when we see a program come along that can essentially create music with a single prompt in many different styles, it's intimidating. But I don't think you need to be intimidated just yet, because it's not taking away your ability to surpass it. You can still create something that AI can't. AI is going to be able to do the traditional stuff, the fun stuff in some ways, but it can also push you to create something better, something new, something that AI cannot do. And I think in the future, especially, and that future could be soon, we're going to be able to use it to create better demos and to refine what we've already created, because AIs are basically something that can analyze a system in a really kind of profound way and then let us know what that system's made of. And so that is helpful to a composer, because when you know what a system's made of, you can work with it, you can edit it, you can improve it. And humans are very good system builders. We created AI, for better or worse. So let me know what you think. Let me know how you feel about all this. My recommendation, you have to invest in yourself. Take private lessons, not from me necessarily, but from someone. Find a good instructor and work towards your goals. And I have a lot of programs that you can kind of work through as well that take this philosophy of mine and put it into the actual teaching and training. And that's something that we can all strive for. There's AI ear train naps now, but I offer a unique approach. I offer an approach that might work for you. And you can do the same thing. You can say, this is music. It's not AI generated music. It's something different. And you can create and continue to exist in this world and make your music stand out. Something I'm going to talk about in future episodes. How do you make your music stand out?